Imagine waking up and finding out the rules of international law enforcement have just, well, they've literally evaporated overnight.
Yeah, the lines separating standard police work from all-out military warfare are just completely gone.
Exactly. And that is exactly the situation you are stepping into today. We are looking at a major, sudden shift in international military operations has just occurred. We're going to break down exactly what happened, the mechanisms that allowed it to happen, and ultimately why it matters to you. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, our mission is to unpack a very specific, highly detailed article from a Patreon page. It's simply titled, U.S. Military Forces Conduct Lethal Strikes in Ecuador. We are basically tracing the rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in Latin America.
Right, tracking how it moved from the sea to a brief advisory role and then straight into lethal ground strikes.
But before we get into the weeds, we have to lay down a really important disclaimer.
Yeah, we need to acknowledge the sensitivity of what we are covering today. We're examining highly charged military actions directed by the Trump administration, along with actions taken by foreign governments like Ecuador and Venezuela.
And severe condemnations from United Nations experts. So we want to be incredibly clear up front to you, the listener. We are not taking sides here.
Not all.
We are not endorsing any of the military actions, nor are we validating the criticisms against them. Our only job in this deep dive is to strictly and impartially break down the facts, the official statements, and the varied perspectives exactly as they're presented in this source material.
We are just here to give you the information completely unfiltered by our own opinions so you can understand the mechanics of this huge geopolitical shift.
Right. So where do we start?
I think the sheer speed of this escalation is the most jarring element we're looking at.
Yeah.
We aren't just looking at a slow, bureaucratic shift in foreign policy. We are talking about an operational pivot that transformed U.S. involvement from a purely advisory capacity to lethal ground strikes in a matter of mere days. Mere days.
Yeah. In the realm of international military engagement, that timeline is pretty much unprecedented.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline because it moves incredibly fast. The sequence of events kicked off on March 2nd. General Francis Donovan, the head of U.S. Southern Command, visits Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa in the capital, Quito.
Right, and at that point, they are just having high-level security discussions, diplomatic handshakes.
Exactly. Then, the very next day, March 3rd, U.S. Southern Command announces that U.S. and Ecuadorian forces have launched joint operations against designated terrorist organizations. But at that specific stage, U.S. Special Forces were strictly in an advisory and support role.
They were helping Ecuadorian commandos, but they were definitely not pulling the trigger.
Right.
They were providing intelligence, perhaps tactical guidance, but they were intentionally kept away from direct ground combat. That was the official posture on March 3rd. But then, just a few days later on Friday, the U.S. military officially confirmed it had conducted lethal kinetic operations on land. We should probably define that term for a moment for anyone unfamiliar. Lethal kinetic operations is essentially military speak for active physical force.
Yeah, we aren't talking about cyber attacks or surveillance drones, just, observing a target.
Right. Kinetic means dropping munitions, exchanging gunfire, physically destroying infrastructure. To go from diplomatic handshakes to advisory support to confirmed kinetic strikes in under a week.
It completely bypasses months of traditional parliamentary debate or rules of engagement drafting that you would typically see.
It's staggering, and we need to look at exactly who was on the receiving end of those kinetic strikes. The source details that the initial operation targeted a group called Comandos de la Frontera,
Which is identified as a Colombian drug trafficking group operating across the border in northern Ecuador.
Yeah. And the Friday attack didn't just target a few individuals, it completely destroyed a supply complex. It took out a rest area used by a leader of the group known by the alias Monotole.
They also hit a designated training area for these traffickers. And, striking a supply complex and a rest area implies a highly sophisticated pre-planned tactical operation.
This isn't a street-level shootout between local police and a cartel.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It is the systematic military dismantling of logistical infrastructure. But to really understand how a foreign military could legally and logistically conduct these types of kinetic strikes on sovereign soil, You have to look at the domestic atmosphere in Ecuador right now.
Because the country basically considers itself fundamentally under siege.
Exactly.
The rhetoric coming from the Ecuadorian leadership absolutely reflects that siege mentality. For example, President Daniel Noboa released a video showing the destroyed site from the Friday strike, and his declaration was unwavering. He stated, "We will find them. Wherever they hide, we will be there."
It's intense.
And it goes further. Following that, Ecuador's Interior Minister, John Reinberg, addressed citizens in 4 separate provinces that have been placed under strict curfew. His message was chillingly direct. He just said, "Stay home, we are at war."
What's fascinating here is how that domestic framing of a war by Ecuadorian leaders actually paved the way for foreign lethal intervention on their soil.
How so?
Well, by officially declaring a state of war, rather than just calling it a massive crime wave or a public emergency, the Ecuadorian government fundamentally altered the legal and operational landscape.
They changed the rules of the game.
Precisely. President Noboa has staked his entire presidency on combating this record-breaking cartel-driven violence. When he announced that Ecuador was beginning a new phase against narco-terrorism and illegal mining, he was effectively sending out an open invitation for a military-grade response.
Replacing the traditional law enforcement paradigm entirely.
Yes.
And that domestic invitation dovetails directly into the wider U.S. strategy we are tracking in this document. This ground operation in Ecuador isn't just an isolated incident. It represents a major new chapter in the Trump administration's aggressive anti-drug campaign across Latin America.
It's a definitive shift. They are moving from naval operations to terrestrial ground operations.
And we really need to look at the naval buildup to understand the scale of what is happening.
Absolutely. Before anyone stepped foot in Ecuador, U.S. forces had already been executing a massive campaign at sea since taking office. The military had conducted approximately 45 attacks against vessels suspected of drug trafficking in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific.
45 attacks.
Yeah. And this wasn't just a Cold War of intimidation. Those naval operations resulted in more than 150 deaths.
To put this in perspective for you, it's comparable to a law enforcement agency upgrading from setting up coastal roadblocks to carrying out active, heavily armed neighborhood raids. It is a massive jurisdictional leap. We are jumping from Coast Guard-style maritime interdiction, which has a very long established legal precedent in international waters, straight into unilateral kinetic strikes inside a sovereign nation's borders.
Intercepting a smuggling boat in the open ocean is one thing. Dropping munitions on a training camp in northern Ecuador completely erases the border between a criminal justice problem and a theater of war.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That jurisdictional leap was enabled by a very specific administrative mechanism.
The relabeling.
Right. The administration made a calculated decision to officially reclassify these groups. They designated the Ecuadorian criminal networks, known as Los Lobos and Los Choneros, as foreign terrorist organizations.
And the moment you change the label from criminal network to foreign terrorist organization, the legal handcuffs come off.
It stops being a police matter.
Right. Suddenly these suspects aren't entitled to due process, Miranda rights, or extradition hearings. By applying the terrorist label, these cartel members are legally transformed into combatants,
making them legitimate targets for a military force.
Exactly. The terminology used dictates the weaponry allowed. You can see the strategic relabeling perfectly reflected in the official confirmations coming from U.S. leadership right now.
Like the Pentagon statement.
Yes. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell posted on X regarding the strikes, stating, "At Ecuador's request, the War Department executed targeted actions to advance our shared goal of dismantling narco-terrorist networks."
Notice the deliberate use of the phrase narco-terrorist.
It cements that new legal designation perfectly.
And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth leaned into the exact same rhetoric. He separately stated that U.S. forces were conducting strikes against narco-terrorist sites on land in partnership with Ecuador. And he followed that up with a very clear warning, ominously adding, "There will be much more to come."
The entire justification for this kinetic response hinges on that terrorism designation.
So what does this all mean? If you zoom out and look at the entire region of Latin America, why is this happening in Ecuador right now?
That is the big question. Because while the sheer speed of this escalation is notable, the location of this escalation caught many geopolitical observers entirely off guard.
Yeah, the source points out this was a huge geographic surprise.
If you asked analysts a few months ago where a U.S. ground expansion in the war on drugs would most likely happen, the expectation was overwhelmingly that it would target Mexico or Colombia.
Which logically makes sense. Both of those countries historically possess much larger, more deeply entrenched cartel networks that dominate the global drug trade.
Yet, it was Ecuador that became the hemisphere's first testing ground for lethal U.S. ground operations against cartel infrastructure.
And the reason Ecuador bypassed those other nations goes right back to President Noboa's strategy. Ecuador became the testing ground because Noboa actively and enthusiastically sought Washington's support.
He was facing unprecedented violence that threatened to completely overwhelm the state apparatus. So he willingly opened the door to the U.S. military to help him regain control of his country.
It was a requested intervention by a host nation.
It was. However, this is where we have to maintain our strict neutrality and examine the conflicting viewpoints presented in the text, because not everyone views this partnership as a positive development.
Right. While Ecuador and the U.S. see this as a necessary, legally requested alliance, critics view it through a much harsher lens.
Especially because this incursion into Ecuador follows another highly controversial military action detailed in the source. There was a January raid in Venezuela that was aimed at capturing President Nicolas Maduro.
So now we have two significant military operations on sovereign Latin American soil in a very short period. Critics and United Nations experts are looking at the Venezuela raid, combining it with this rapid escalation in Ecuador, and condemning the entire strategy.
They're calling this a broader and deeply troubling pattern of military aggression by the United States.
If we connect this to the bigger picture.
Actually, yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you are presented with two completely distinct narratives driving real-world events. On one side, the U.S. and Ecuadorian governments view this escalation as a desperate, partnered necessity to dismantle heavily armed narco-terrorist groups that are destroying a sovereign nation from the inside out.
They argue that traditional law enforcement has failed.
Right. That military intervention is literally the only language these cartels understand.
But on the flip side, you have the narrative from critics in international bodies like the UN. They look at the 45 naval attacks, the raid in Venezuela, and the sudden shift to land strikes in Ecuador, and they see a dangerous overreach.
They view this as a violation of international norms, where military force is being recklessly deployed to solve what has historically been treated as a complex, systemic criminal justice issue.
And as a listener trying to navigate these headlines, analyzing both of these perspectives is vital to your understanding of global affairs. It prevents information overload.
Exactly. The mechanics of how a criminal group gets designated as a terrorist organization and how a host country's declaration of war allows foreign military strikes, well, it provides the blueprint for how international conflicts will likely be fought in the near future.
You now have the deep context to understand exactly what is happening beneath the surface the next time you see a headline about drug policy or U.S. deployments.
You know about the preceding naval campaign that resulted in 150 deaths.
You know about the rapid 3-day timeline from an advisory role to lethal kinetic strikes.
You understand how designating a group like Los Lobos as a foreign terrorist organization completely rewrites the rules of engagement.
You are watching the active, real-time blurring of the lines between law enforcement and military warfare.
This raises an important question about the durability of international boundaries and traditional law enforcement norms. What we are witnessing in Ecuador might not just be an isolated response to a local crisis.
It could very well be the new standard operating procedure for how powerful nations project force against transnational criminal networks.
It really could.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own as you digest all of this. It's something that builds on what we've discussed but goes a step further. If direct military ground strikes and airstrikes become the new accepted standard for combating drug trafficking across the hemisphere, how will these heavily armed, localized cartels evolve their tactics to survive against the world's most advanced military?
That's a terrifying thought.
And furthermore, what happens to the everyday civilian populations who suddenly find their neighborhoods turned into literal, internationally recognized war zones?
The ripple effects of treating crime syndicates as military targets will undoubtedly reshape regional stability for decades to come. Thank you for exploring the complexities of this geopolitical shift with us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the narrative, and we will catch you next time.